the view of a game is important. And it's easy to gloss over because people don't tend to talk about it. That's because they don't tend to see it. If it's working properly, it'll be like it doesn't exist at all. So, we're just going to talk a little bit about how to keep the player on screen. For a simple puzzle game, there's a pretty easy way to do this, where if your level's small, you can just fix the camera in place and zoom out. And this can work for small levels, because this is the optimal scenario. You want your camera to move as little as possible while keeping everything on screen. However, in most games it doesn't work because the level's big enough that the player would become a dot. If the players suspect, the player isn't going to actually know what's going on. So what I'm going to do is just going to resume here, and I'm just going to show you what a basic fixed camera is like. This is a camera that is fixed to the player. It's just exactly centered on the player, other than of course some of the camera bounds. Turn on fixed follow, smooth follow. So that's what this is like. So this is okay. If your player movement is very smooth, then this can of course work. And the other thing about this is it means that you can zoom the camera in more, because the player is guaranteed to always be on screen. There's a couple of problems though that will result in certain games, which is if you can afford it, you want little movements by the player to not cause the camera to move at all. So you see, if I jump here, the camera moves a bit up and down, and even though we both know that the player is on screen and is absolutely fine, the player is in no danger of leaving the screen in this scenario. The other thing is, if the player is moving a lot, then that means the camera is always moving, and we're also kind of not directing where the player should go, which is... So, in a lot of games like Mario, the designers have actually intended to make sure you know how to go right by just placing Mario on the left. And that is actually huge. You can just offset the player from the center of the screen, and the player will be directed to go in that direction. So what I want to do is, we're going to start just by smoothing out the camera a bit more, which if you have a game where your player isn't moving very smoothly, where it's very fast and it's all over the place, this is something you're going to have to do. This is called lerping, which is done through interpolation. So I'm not going to get into the mathy bits, but essentially the camera is smoothly moving towards where the player is. It's kind of falling behind because of course we're not locked to the player. And this is okay. If you're focusing a whole lot of stuff on screen, this can kind of work. But if there's one thing on screen, then you're going to want to make sure that you're pointing towards where the player should go, and that you have all the important information of where the player is going on screen, which is to make sure, of course, that if they're going to go really fast and smash into something, they want to see it. So the way to do this is called extrapolation. Essentially, if I am moving the player and I go over and turn on my draw debug, where are you, draw debug? This little dot exists. This is where the camera is interpolating to now, which is right in front of the player. So I'm just using the velocity of the player to determine a point where I think the player will be next. And the result is something like this. So the player is now directed towards where they're going. They're seeing all the information towards where they're headed, and it is better that way. You also notice that when I move a little bit, it's fixed. And this isn't a matter of extrapolation. This actually becomes worse with extrapolation, because if you do a little movement but you're going very fast in that movement, then the camera might be all over the place. It can be above the player, suddenly below the player. But in this scenario, I have a little box around the player. And if that little dot hasn't left the box, then the camera just won't move. So little movements, little jumps, these things don't move the player, but if the player moves out of that box, then the camera snaps to the player. So, the last thing I'm going to talk about is about focusing on multiple things. You'll see just in that moment, there's suddenly one platform left. And suddenly the camera is not on the player. And this is actually intentional. I'm directing you here. This is on screen. Look, this is important. There's like a big arrow sign going in this direction. So this will be kind of important for your cinematics in games. You'll generally see this happen where they'll keep the player on screen, but they'll say, hey, it's in this direction from you, this big importance thing, go there. So when there's one last thing left, I make sure to zoom the camera in and out to try and keep both on screen, and I direct the player towards it. So that is views in games, and this is how it works in my game, Spectrum Break.